Imagine a tall townhouse somewhere in a quiet, respectable corner of London, or perhaps Bath, or perhaps one of the newer, leafier streets of a fast-growing industrial city, sometime in the middle years of the 19th century. It's early morning, the kind of soft grey morning that London specialises in, and the house around us is already, quietly, beginning to stir. Downstairs, a scullery maid has been awake for close to 2 hours already, coaxing a kitchen range back to life, while somewhere above her, behind a heavy bedroom door with its curtains still drawn against the light, a very different morning is only just beginning, slowly, deliberately, and almost entirely without the woman in that bed lifting a single finger to start it. This is the world of a wealthy Victorian woman, and tonight we're going to spend a full day inside it together, from the moment her eyes open to the moment her candle is finally snuffed out at the end of a long, carefully managed evening. So let your own eyes grow heavy. Let your shoulders sink back into whatever surface is holding you right now. And let's step quietly into a Victorian morning that is, in its own strange and cushioned way, about to become surprisingly full. Let's begin with waking, because even something as simple as opening one's eyes was, in a household like this, never quite as simple as it sounds. A lady's maid, already dressed and moving softly through the dim room, would typically be the one to draw back the heavy curtains, letting in whatever grey daylight London or Bath or Manchester happened to be offering that particular morning, and it was this maid, not the lady herself, who had usually been awake first, checking that the fire in the bedroom grate had been laid and lit sometime before dawn by yet another servant lower still in the household's careful hierarchy, so that the room would already be warm by the time its occupant stirred. Water for washing had been carried up in heavy jugs, heated in the kitchen far below and kept warm under cloths, because plumbing of the kind we take utterly for granted today was, for most of this period, still a rare and expensive luxury even in genuinely wealthy homes. A wealthy Victorian woman did not, as a rule, dress herself. Not fully, not without help, and this wasn't laziness or excess so much as a simple mechanical fact of the clothing itself. Corsets laced up the back required another pair of hands entirely. Layers of petticoats, sometimes as many as 5 or 6 depending on the fashion of the particular decade, needed to be arranged just so, each one settling correctly over the last before the outer dress itself could even be considered. Buttons ran the length of a woman's back in long, unbroken rows that no person could possibly manage alone, however flexible their own arms might be. So the lady's maid worked steadily, quietly, through perhaps 40 minutes or more of careful lacing, smoothing, pinning and arranging, while her mistress stood, or sat, largely passive throughout, occasionally offering a quiet instruction about which brooch or which shade of ribbon she preferred for the particular activities the day ahead was expected to hold. Breakfast, once she was finally dressed and her hair arranged, usually elaborately, often with the help of hot curling tongs heated directly in the fire and handled with real skill by a maid who had learned, through long practice, exactly how long to hold them against a lock of hair before the risk of scorching became too great, was rarely a rushed or casual affair. In many wealthy households, breakfast was taken formally in a dedicated breakfast room, smaller and cosier than the grand dining room reserved for evening meals, but still laid with real care. A white cloth, proper china, silver cutlery polished the evening before by yet another servant whose entire job, in the largest households, might consist of little else but the endless quiet maintenance of silver. The meal itself might include eggs, cold meats, toast kept warm in a silver rack designed for exactly that purpose, marmalade and tea poured from a pot that had likely been resting under a padded cosy to keep it from cooling too quickly in a house that, however grand, was still heated only by open fires and therefore prone to real, biting cold in its corridors and unused rooms. Correspondence often arrived during or just after breakfast, and a wealthy woman's morning post could be substantial. Invitations to dinners and calls and charitable committee meetings, letters from relatives near and far, tradesmen's bills that would, in most households, be handled not by her directly, but passed along to her husband or to the household steward, since the actual movement of money, however much of it was spent maintaining her particular lifestyle, was very rarely something a Victorian wife controlled directly herself. The mid-morning hours, once breakfast had been cleared and the correspondence dealt with, were typically given over to what contemporary etiquette manuals, and there were a great many of them published throughout this period, referred to simply as household management, though the phrase rather understates how genuinely demanding this work could actually be. A wealthy Victorian woman did not, in most cases, cook, clean or launder anything herself, but she was, in a very real sense, running a small and complicated business, one with a staff that might range from 3 or 4 servants in a modestly wealthy home to 20 or more in a genuinely grand one, each with distinct responsibilities, wages, meals, and personalities that needed careful, ongoing management. Menus for the coming days had to be planned and discussed with the cook, often in a brief formal meeting held each morning in which the mistress of the house would review proposed dishes, adjust them according to expected guests or seasonal availability, and approve the day's shopping list. Household accounts needed regular review, since even wealthy families kept careful track of expenditure on food, coal, candles, and the countless smaller items a large house consumed constantly, and a woman with a genuine head for figures, which many Victorian women absolutely possessed despite receiving little formal education in mathematics, could save a household a meaningful sum simply through careful, attentive oversight. New servants needed to be interviewed and hired when older ones left or were dismissed, references checked, character assessed in brief conversations that could feel, on both sides, remarkably like a formal audition. Linens needed periodic inventory. China and glassware needed accounting for breakages. It was, in short, the unglamorous administrative backbone that kept a large Victorian household actually functioning, and it fell, almost entirely, to the woman of the house to manage it, quietly, competently, and very often without any particular acknowledgement that this work constituted real labour at all. By early afternoon, once the practical business of the household had been dealt with, attention typically turned to what Victorian society called calling, and if you've never encountered this particular ritual before, it's worth slowing down here, because it genuinely governed enormous amounts of a wealthy woman's time and energy. Paying calls meant visiting the homes of other women within one's social circle, usually for a carefully calibrated period of perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, no longer, during which polite, largely inconsequential conversation was exchanged over tea before the visitor rose, made her farewells, and moved on to the next house on her list. This might sound simple, even pleasant, but the underlying rules were dense and genuinely unforgiving, Calling hours were fixed, typically somewhere in the early to mid-afternoon. Calling cards, small printed cards bearing one's name, had to be left with the servant at each door, sometimes even when the lady of the house wasn't calling in person, but merely acknowledging a social connection and the precise way a card was folded, or which corner was turned down, carried its own coded meaning entirely legible to anyone versed in the etiquette, but utterly opaque to an outsider. A new acquaintance in the neighbourhood had to be called upon first by an established resident, never the reverse, since it was considered improper for a newcomer to presume acceptance before it had been formally extended. Failing to return a call within an appropriate window, usually understood to be within a matter of days, could be read as a genuine social slight, sometimes an irreparable one. A woman with a large social circle might spend 2 or 3 full afternoons a week almost entirely on this single activity, dressed in her second outfit of the day, since calling required its own particular level of formality distinct from the morning's household dress. Riding from house to house in a carriage that needed to be maintained, staffed with a coachman, and kept ready essentially on demand. Afternoons not given over to calling were often filled instead with what the period broadly termed accomplishments, a word that covered an enormous range of activity but generally referred to skills a woman had cultivated, often since childhood, specifically to demonstrate refinement, taste, and gentility rather than any practical necessity. Needlework of various kinds occupied enormous amounts of time, everything from fine embroidery worked onto handkerchiefs and cushion covers to the more ambitious Berlin wool work that produced elaborate pictorial designs, worked stitch by careful stitch from printed patterns, often taking weeks or even months to complete a single substantial piece. Music, too, played a significant role, and a wealthy young woman was very often expected to have received extensive piano or singing instruction, not necessarily because she possessed genuine natural talent, though many did, but because musical accomplishment was considered an essential marker of a properly refined upbringing, something that could be displayed, modestly but effectively, when guests visited in the evening. Sketching and watercolour painting occupied similar territory, and many wealthy Victorian women produced over the course of their lives substantial bodies of amateur artwork, landscapes glimpsed on family travels, careful studies of flowers gathered from the garden, portraits of family members and pets, painted not for any commercial purpose, but simply as one more expected element of a properly cultivated feminine education. Reading, too, filled real hours, novels especially, though a woman's reading was often gently but firmly steered by fathers, husbands, or simply prevailing social expectation toward material considered suitable, improving, or at minimum, not likely to overstimulate a temperament still widely believed, by the medical thinking of the period, to be naturally more delicate and excitable than a man's. As afternoon gave way to evening, the household's rhythm shifted again, and preparation for dinner, particularly on evenings when guests were expected, could occupy a genuinely significant stretch of time. A wealthy Victorian woman changed clothes again, into her most formal evening dress of the day, a process that, like the morning's dressing, required real assistance and real time. Her hair rearranged once more, jewellery selected with real care, since the specific pieces worn to a formal dinner carried their own subtle signals about wealth, taste, and family standing. Dinner itself, in a genuinely grand household, could stretch across multiple courses served in careful sequence, each one requiring its own particular cutlery, its own particular wine, its own particular etiquette governing exactly how and when it should be eaten, and a hostess was expected to manage the entire evening's flow with apparent effortlessness, directing conversation, ensuring no guest sat in uncomfortable silence for too long, watching quietly for any sign that a dish needed to be cleared or a glass refilled, all while appearing, to any outside observer, to be doing essentially nothing at all beyond graciously enjoying her own dinner party. After dinner, in households that followed the fuller formal tradition, the women would typically withdraw to a separate drawing room, leaving the men to their port and their more serious, often political conversation. And it was in this drawing room, over tea and quieter, more intimate conversation, that a great deal of the period's genuine female friendship and social alliance building actually took place, away from male oversight, in a space understood by everyone present to belong, for this particular hour of the evening, entirely to the women themselves. Somewhere in the middle of all this, tucked between the morning's household business and the afternoon's calling, a wealthy Victorian woman's relationship with her own children unfolded in a way that can feel, from where we sit now, genuinely surprising. In the largest and wealthiest households, children lived quite literally in a separate part of the house entirely, a nursery suite tucked away on an upper floor, staffed by a nurse or, as the children grew older, a governess, whose job it was to manage almost every practical aspect of a child's daily existence. Feeding, washing, dressing, early lessons in reading and letters, discipline, and the countless small rhythms of a young child's day. A mother's contact with her own children, in households of this kind, was often formalized into a specific daily appointment, commonly referred to simply as the children's hour, typically held in the late afternoon, during which the children, freshly washed and dressed in their best clothes, would be brought downstairs to spend perhaps 30 minutes to an hour with their mother in the drawing room, showing her some small piece of schoolwork, reciting a poem learned that week, or simply sitting quietly nearby while she asked after their day. It would be easy to read this arrangement as cold or distant by our own standards, and in some households it genuinely was experienced that way, both by mothers who felt real, aching separation from children raised largely by other hands, and by children who grew up feeling closer, in practical daily terms, to a beloved nurse than to their own mother. But it's worth resisting too simple a judgment here, because plenty of Victorian mothers used this carefully bounded time with real intention and real warmth, and the deeper emotional bond between mother and child, in countless surviving letters and diaries from the period, comes through as genuinely deep and genuinely felt, however formally structured its practical expression happened to be. As daughters grew older, particularly once they'd passed beyond the nursery years entirely, this relationship often shifted again, mothers taking a much more direct hands-on role in preparing a daughter for her own eventual entry into adult society, teaching her the same accomplishments, the same careful etiquette, the same quiet management skills that had filled the mother's own days, in a kind of ongoing generational handing down of exactly the life we've been sitting inside tonight. Shopping, too, filled real portions of a wealthy woman's week, though it looked rather different from the shopping we know today. Rather than browsing finished goods on open shelves, A wealthy Victorian woman's relationship with clothing typically ran through a dressmaker, a skilled professional, almost always a woman herself, who might be visited at her own small premises, or, for the wealthiest clients, summoned directly to the client's own home, bringing with her a portfolio of fashion plates, small hand-coloured illustrations showing the latest silhouettes arriving from Paris, and a careful selection of fabric samples in silk, wool, and the newer, more affordable cottons made possible by industrial mills that had transformed textile production across the preceding decades. A single formal dress could require several separate fitting appointments, spaced across a period of weeks, as the dressmaker and her small team of assistants cut, pinned, and stitched the garment directly to the wearer's own particular figure, since ready-made clothing in anything approaching a modern sense simply didn't exist yet for garments of this quality and formality. Beyond the dressmaker, a wealthy woman's shopping might also take her to a milliner for hats, a specialist purveyor of gloves and fans, and the countless small accessories that a properly dressed Victorian lady was expected to carry, and, for household rather than personal purchases, to specialist shops selling tea, linens, or imported goods that had, in many cases, travelled remarkable distances. Tea from China or India, silk from the same distant regions, sugar from plantations in the Caribbean, all part of a vast, sprawling network of trade and empire that quietly underwrote the comfortable domestic world we've been sitting inside all evening. Whether the woman doing the shopping thought consciously about that wider network or not. Illness, when it came, as it inevitably did in a period before modern medicine had developed anything close to our current understanding of infection, sanitation, or disease, occupied its own particular place in a wealthy woman's daily rhythm. And it's worth pausing here, gently, because health and its careful management genuinely shaped enormous stretches of Victorian domestic life. A wealthy household typically retained a family physician on something close to a standing basis, a doctor who knew the family well and could be summoned, for a fee, whenever illness struck, though the actual medical tools available to him remained, by our own standards, remarkably limited. A mixture of genuine emerging science and older, less reliable tradition. Bloodletting still occasionally practiced in the earlier decades of the period, along with a wide range of tonics, tinctures, and patent remedies whose actual effectiveness varied enormously and whose ingredients in some cases would raise real alarm today. Chronic ill health, real or perceived, also occupied a curious cultural space within wealthy Victorian femininity more broadly, with a certain delicate frailty, sometimes almost fashionable, considered by prevailing medical and social thinking to be a natural, even expected feature of refined female constitution, particularly during the middle decades of the period. Women experiencing what we might today recognize as anxiety, depression, or simple physical exhaustion from the relentless social and domestic demands of their daily lives were often diagnosed instead with vague, poorly understood conditions like nervous exhaustion or hysteria, treated with rest cures that could, in their most extreme forms, involve weeks of near total isolation, forbidden even from reading or engaging in conversation, a treatment we now recognize as having done real, sometimes lasting harm to the women subjected to it. Pregnancy and childbirth, too, carried genuine physical risk throughout this entire period, attended by physicians whose understanding of infection control remained, for much of the century, dangerously incomplete, and a wealthy Victorian woman, whatever material comfort surrounded her, faced these particular chapters of her life with a level of real physical uncertainty that can be genuinely difficult for us to fully imagine from where we sit now. Religious observance and charitable work too wove steadily through the fabric of a wealthy Victorian woman's week, and it's worth understanding just how much genuine time and effort this particular thread actually demanded. Sunday church attendance was, for the vast majority of wealthy families, entirely non-negotiable. A full morning given over to the local parish church, dressed in one's most respectable Sunday clothing, seated in a pew that had in many cases been paid for and reserved specifically for the family's own use. Its position within the church itself a quiet, unspoken marker of social standing, every bit as legible to the rest of the congregation as any calling card. Beyond Sunday worship, many wealthy women devoted real, substantial hours during the week to organise charitable work, a category of activity that occupied a genuinely important and somewhat unusual place in Victorian society, since it represented one of the very few areas of public, organised, quasi-professional activity considered entirely appropriate for a respectable woman to engage in. Committees formed to support local hospitals, orphanages and schools for poor children met regularly, and a wealthy woman with real organisational skill might find herself, in practice, managing budgets, coordinating volunteers, and overseeing genuinely significant charitable projects, work that, however unpaid and however carefully framed within the acceptable language of feminine benevolence and duty, nonetheless drew on exactly the same skills of administration and leadership she exercised daily within her own household. Visiting the poor directly formed another common thread of this charitable work. Wealthy women travelling, sometimes accompanied by a servant for propriety and safety, into considerably less comfortable neighbourhoods to deliver food, clothing, or simple moral encouragement to families experiencing real hardship, encounters that exposed many wealthy women, often for the first time in any sustained way, to a level of poverty and suffering entirely invisible from within their own comfortable domestic world. For some women, this charitable work became a genuine source of purpose and quiet satisfaction, beyond the narrower domestic sphere otherwise available to them, a handful eventually channeling this early charitable experience into more formal, sustained social reform work as the century progressed, laying groundwork, in some cases, for the broader women's movements that would gather real momentum in the decades that followed. Evenings that didn't involve formal dinner parties still rarely passed in true idleness, and it's worth spending a little time here in this quieter, more intimate stretch of the day before we finally let the candles burn down. Letter writing occupied real and substantial time within a wealthy Victorian woman's evening hours. Correspondence maintained across genuinely wide distances with family members who had married into other households. Friends from earlier chapters of life now scattered across the country, or, increasingly as the century progressed, across the wider British Empire itself. These letters, many of which survive today in family archives and museum collections, offer some of the richest and most genuinely honest windows we have into the actual interior lives of Victorian women, containing real warmth, real complaint, real humour, and real anxiety far removed from the carefully composed public performance of a formal afternoon call. Reading aloud, too, formed a common evening activity within the wider family circle. One family member, often though not exclusively the woman of the house, reading a novel or a piece of poetry aloud to husband and children gathered together near the fire, a practice that served both as genuine entertainment in an age before radio, television, or recorded music, and as a quiet, ongoing exercise in shared family literacy and taste. Music, again, found its place here too, an evening spent at the piano, playing and singing for a small gathered audience of family or close friends, the same skill cultivated so carefully in childhood, now put to its intended quiet domestic use decades later. And beneath all of these particular activities, whatever specific shape a given evening happened to take, ran the same steady undercurrent that had shaped the entire day behind it. A life lived largely within careful, well-understood boundaries, filled nonetheless, in its own quiet and complicated way, with real skill, real relationship, real purpose, and real, if narrowly channeled, achievement. It would be dishonest to suggest that this life, cushioned and materially comfortable as it undeniably was, came without real and sometimes genuinely painful limitation. A wealthy Victorian woman typically had no legal right to her own property once married, since it passed, under the law, as it stood for much of this period, directly into her husband's control. She had extremely limited access to higher education, almost none to most professions, and very little say, in the earlier decades of the era especially, over decisions that shaped her own life in the most fundamental ways, from whom she might marry to how her own children would eventually be raised and educated. The elaborate rituals of calling, dressing, and household management that filled so many of her waking hours existed, in part precisely because so many other avenues of activity, intellectual, professional, political, remained firmly and deliberately closed to her. But within these very real constraints, countless Victorian women built genuinely rich, capable, purposeful lives, running complicated households with real skill, raising children with real care and often real intellectual seriousness, building networks of female friendship and mutual support that sustained them through decades of a society not always inclined to notice or value their labour. And it's worth holding both of these truths gently together as we come, now toward the end of this particular evening we've spent inside. So let the last candle in that quiet Victorian drawing room burn down slowly now, its flame growing smaller, softer, until only a faint curl of smoke rises where the light used to be. Let the murmur of after-dinner conversation fade to nothing, the last carriage outside finally rolling away down a cobbled street gone dark and silent, the last servant somewhere below climbing wearily toward her own narrow bed at the very top of the house. The wealthy Victorian woman we've spent this evening beside has finished her long day now, corsets loosened, hair unpinned, the countless small performances of the day finally set aside until morning brings them all quietly back again. You don't need to carry any of it any further tonight. Whatever weight the day has left with you, real or imagined, can simply rest here in the dark alongside her, safe and still and done with for now. If this quiet evening among candlelight and calling cards helped ease you gently towards sleep, feel free to leave a soft tap of a thumb before your eyes closed the rest of the way, and let us know in the comments which quiet corner of the old world you'd like us to sit inside next. And if you'd like more evenings exactly like this one, waiting for you whenever sleep won't quite come, consider following the show so the next candle is already lit and ready. For now, though, none of that needs your attention. There is only the dark, hushed comfort of a long day finally over, and the deep, patient knowledge that morning, whenever it comes, will bring the whole quiet ritual gently back around again. Rest now. The house is settled. It always was,